Based on what you learned in Chapter 1, you know that there's a difference between a statement and an argument. We make and are exposed to lots of statements every day. People make statements all the time, but being a good critical thinker means that we don't just accept those statements on face value. Being a good critical thinker means that you need evidence to back up those statements before you believe them, and that you're then going to evaluate that evidence to determine whether or not it's good evidence. So that, of course, is where arguments come in. Arguments provide support for statements. It's how we back up those statements that we make. Arguments themselves include a set of statements, some of which are intended to support another statement, thus the difference between premises and conclusions. Premises are the support statements, and the conclusion is that statement the premise statements are intended to support. So, to begin with, when it comes to looking at arguments, we have to decide, first of all, is this an argument? And then what kind of argument is it? But even before that, we may have to determine whether or not there are actually some statements there. So a statement is simply an assertion that something either is or is not the case. We can think of a statement as being a claim. Someone's making a claim about something. So there are some examples of some statements on the screen, but there's also some information about some things that statements are not. They're not questions. They're not commands, they're not exclamations, they're just assertions or claims. So a claim that something is the case. Now, an argument gives us reasons for believing that something is the case. So those arguments include statements that try to back up and try to provide support, give us the reasons for some conclusion. Now, arguments can be sometimes confused with explanations, but an explanation instead tells us why or how something is the case. It does not give us reasons for believing that something is the case. So that's the difference between an argument and an explanation. So again, just as a review of these terms, a statement is a claim, an assumption, or an assertion that something is or is not the case. But we talked about how arguments include a set of statements, some of which are the premises, what we call premise statements, and then one of which is a conclusion statement. So a premise statement is a statement in an argument that's given in support of some other statement, and that other statement that the premise statement is trying to support is the conclusion. So in an argument, you're likely to have more than one premise statement, but you typically have one conclusion statement. So when you're trying to use your good critical thinking skills and think about statements or claims and arguments and that kind of thing, you want to analyze and dissect those arguments. But even before you get to the point of analyzing the argument itself, you have to decide, is it an argument? You may even have to determine whether or not something is a statement and what those claims are and that kind of thing. So if you're going to try to identify arguments and really spend some time analyzing them, the first thing you can look for is the conclusion. Look for the conclusion, the thing that the writer or the speaker is trying to persuade you to believe first. And once you identify that conclusion, then you can kind of work your way back and figure out, okay, what are the premises that are supporting that conclusion? So after identifying the conclusion, the next step is to find the premises. So at this point, you want to ask, what claim is this writer or speaker offering to make me believe in the conclusion? What are they giving me to support that conclusion that they're making? So here's an example from your textbook. It's one of those examples in the exercises at the end of chapter 1. You can take a minute to read through the example, and then I want you to decide, is this an argument? And if so, try to pick out the conclusion and the premises. So pause the video and take a couple of minutes to analyze that and try to make those determinations. Okay, so this example actually is an argument because it is trying to persuade us of something, and it gives us some reasons for what it's trying to persuade us of. So we know that it's an argument. So now we need to identify what is the conclusion and then what are the premises. So we need to ask to begin with, what claim is the writer or speaker trying to persuade me to believe? So in this case, that writer is trying to persuade you that you're not fit to serve in your current capacity. So this last statement, therefore, you are not fit to serve in your current capacity, that would be the conclusion. And then in terms of a premise, you have been absent from work too many times, you've neglected your duties on several occasions. Those are examples of premise statements. A couple of other examples for you to pause the video and think about as well. Again, remember, is it an argument? And then if it is an argument, ask yourself those questions to try to determine the conclusion and any premises that are part of that. So that first one, racial profiling is not an issue for white people, but it is an issue for African Americans. That one is not an argument. So it is a statement, but there aren't any reasons to back that up, and so that would not be considered an argument. The second one, on the other hand, witches are real. They're mentioned in the Bible. There are many people today who claim to be witches, and historical records reveal that there were witches in Salem. That one actually is an argument. So in this case, the conclusion is witches are real. And then there are a few premise statements there as well. First premise, they're mentioned in the Bible. Second premise, there are many people today who claim to be witches. Third premise, historical records reveal that there were witches in Salem. And so we spent a couple of minutes working with those examples. There are other examples in those exercises at the end of chapter 1 that you can take a look at as well. So We're going to continue and talk a little bit about analyzing and making a distinction between what we call deductive arguments and inductive arguments. But to begin with, there are a few points related to that. First of all, the point of devising an argument is to try to show that a statement or a claim is worthy of acceptance. So when we make that conclusion statement, that's a claim, and we want to support that. So that's why we devise an argument in the first place. But the point of evaluating an argument is to see whether that task has been successful, whether the argument shows that the statement really is worthy of acceptance. And then when the argument shows that the statement is worthy of acceptance, we say that the argument is good. When the argument fails to show that the statement is worthy of acceptance, we say that the argument is bad. But they're actually different terms we use instead of good and bad, depending on what type of argument we're looking at. So we make a distinction between what we call deductive arguments and inductive arguments. So to begin with, deductive arguments are intended to provide conclusive support for a conclusion. So when we're looking at deductive arguments, they're trying to conclude, yes, this is the case, and trying to provide you with support for that so that you will come to the conclusion that this is conclusively the case, that it is certainly the case. A deductive argument that succeeds in providing conclusive support for its premise is said to be valid. And in some of those exercises you were doing at the end of chapter 3, that's one of the things you are asked to do. First of all, determine what type of argument it was, and then if it's a deductive argument, is that argument valid? So a deductive argument that succeeds in providing conclusive support for its premise is said to be valid. A valid argument is such that if its premises are true, its conclusion must be true. But one thing to keep in mind about those deductive arguments is that there's a difference between arguments that are valid and arguments that are sound. It's possible that we can have a deductively valid argument that is sound, but it's also possible that we can have a deductively valid argument that is not sound. And I think this is one of the areas that was tripping people up as they were working through some of those early examples. Here we have some examples of some deductively valid arguments. So what makes them deductive is that they are meant to offer conclusive support for the conclusion. So they're not using terms like probably or very probably and that kind of thing. They're saying all dogs have fleas. Bowser is a dog, so Bowser has fleas. So they're not giving probable proof or suggesting probabilities and that kind of thing. So you can read over those deductively valid arguments, and we're going to use those arguments a little bit as we talk about some of the things that we can see with deductively valid arguments. Deductively valid arguments can have false premises and a false conclusion and still be considered deductively valid. They can have false premises and a true conclusion, again, and still be considered deductively valid, but they can finally have true premises and a true conclusion and be deductively valid. Now, I think that lots of times people sort of make that assumption that they must have both true premises and a true conclusion in order to be considered deductively valid, but that's not the case. In order for an argument to be considered deductively valid, the conclusion has to follow from the premises. So that's what makes these deductively valid. All dogs have fleas. Bowser is a dog. Those would be your premises. And then, so Bowser has fleas. That's your conclusion. And so, in order for it to be deductively valid, then the conclusion must follow from the premises. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If Austin is happy, then Barb is happy. Barb is not happy. Therefore, Austin is not happy. Now we can look at those examples as being examples of some of these situations here, or at least possibly being examples of those situations there. Now we can argue, someone could make an argument that if Austin is happy, then Barb is happy, and then we can conclude that if Barb is not happy, which she is not, that Austin is not going to be happy either. But we don't know for sure that those premises and conclusions are necessarily true. They could be false, but because they follow, the conclusion follows from those premises. If those premise statements are true, then that conclusion must be true. Then it's considered deductively valid. All dogs have fleas. Bowser is a dog, so Bowser has fleas. Well, that's deductively valid because the conclusion follows from those premise statements. If these premises are true, then this conclusion would have to be true as well. So that's deductively valid. But is it really the case that all dogs have fleas? So in that case, that premise could be false, or at least one of those premises could. Bowser may actually be a dog, but we don't know for sure that all dogs have fleas. So we can't say for sure that Bowser has fleas, so that conclusion may be false as well. But that doesn't mean that it's invalid as an argument, because this is the argument. It's deductively valid because this follows from these premises. But this might be a situation where there are false premises and false conclusions. So when it comes to those deductive arguments, what we're really concerned about in the end is whether or not they are sound. And I think that in the end, that may have been what was tripping people up with some of these examples. Folks were getting deductively valid and sound arguments confused. So in that exercise, that unit assignment from week 2, part 2, folks were given examples of different arguments. And these were the arguments that you were given examples of, and you were asked to work through. The first two were in exercise 3.2, and so you were asked to work through those 4 steps, and we'll look at those 4 steps in just a few minutes. But it turns out that all 3 of these were examples of deductive arguments. And so if we look at those, that first one, either Jack is lying or he is not. If his ears turn red, he's lying. If they don't turn red, he's telling the truth. His ears are red, Jack is lying. We can identify that conclusion, Jack is lying, and then all of that other stuff, either Jack is lying or he is not. If his ears turn red, he's lying. If they don't turn red, he's telling the truth. His ears are red. Those are all premise statements. In that second one, if you go to that party, you're completely nuts. You're going to the party, it necessarily follows that you're nuts. The conclusion here is you're nuts. The premises, if you go to that party, you're completely nuts, you're going to that party. And so we've got those premises, and in both of these cases, we have conclusion statements that necessarily follow from those premises. So that makes them deductively sound. But again, whether or not someone is nuts for going to a party, we can go back once more to these examples of deductively valid arguments with different situations with those premises and conclusions. It may be that that's not necessarily a true premise. So it may also be the case that that's not necessarily a true conclusion. Again, that doesn't mean that this argument is not deductively valid, but the question arises, is it actually a sound argument? And I think, again, that was the issue here with this last one. So the last one came from, that was actually exercise 3.3, and it was number 2 under exercise 3.3. But the example was social welfare is by definition a handout to people who have not worked for it, but giving people money that they have not earned through labor is not helping anyone. It follows then that social welfare does not help anyone. Again, it's deductive because it's trying to provide conclusive information. And in this situation, if we assume that this first premise statement and this second premise statement are both true, then it necessarily follows that this conclusion is true. So it is deductively valid, but the question is that a sound argument? And so in making that determination about whether or not it's deductively valid, some folks were actually arguing the soundness of that argument. And that's when we're looking at whether a deductively valid argument is sound, that's when we are really evaluating these claims that come up. So, in addition to those deductive arguments, we also have inductive arguments. And again, an inductive argument is intended to provide probable support for its conclusion. So instead of saying things like, all dogs have fleas, an example of an inductive argument, or some of the language or wording that would be used in an inductive argument would be something like 95% of dogs have fleas. Therefore, Bowser, my dog, very likely has fleas. So we're talking about probability, we're talking about likelihood, and those are the types of things that suggest an inductive argument. So one of the big ways you make a distinction between a deductive and an inductive argument is by looking at the terms. And you've got some examples in your text of terms that signal a deductive argument, so the type of argument that we were looking at here. Some of those words include, or those phrases include, it necessarily follows that, it logically follows that, absolutely, necessarily, certainly. But then some of the words that signal an inductive argument include things like likely, probably, chances are, odds are, it's plausible that. So those are indicator words that suggest probability. So you may need to pay attention to those indicator words in making that distinction between inductive and deductive arguments. With deductive arguments, we say that they are either valid or invalid. With inductive arguments, on the other hand, we use the terms strong or weak. So an inductive argument that succeeds in providing very probable support for its conclusion is said to be strong. A strong argument is such that if the premises are true, then its conclusion is very probably true. So if we look back at this example, 95% of dogs have fleas, therefore Bowser, my dog, very likely has fleas. That would be considered a strong argument because it is the case that if the premises are true, its conclusion is very probably true. After determining whether that inductive argument is strong or weak, the next thing we want to address is whether or not it's cogent. So an inductively strong argument with true premises is said to be cogent. And this is that next step, sort of like those deductive arguments. We talked about how there can be deductively valid arguments that are not sound. We also have some issues here with inductive arguments and whether or not they are cogent. In order to be cogent, that inductive argument must be strong, and it must have true premises. An uncogent argument can be a strong argument, but it may have one or more false premises. And so that's the difference between a cogent argument and one that is not cogent. So in your textbook, you were given this four-step process for judging arguments. And if you work your way through that four-step process, ideally, you should be able to determine whether an argument is deductive or inductive, and then whether it gives good reasons for accepting the conclusion. So if it is deductive, whether it's valid or invalid. If it's inductive, whether it is strong or weak. But then, again, you would ideally need to go that step further, and with deductive arguments, determine whether they're sound or not, and with inductive arguments, determine whether they are cogent or not. And some of the things that you're looking at now will help you with that part of making those determinations. So as I was given feedback for the week 2, part 2 unit assignment, and some people weren't doing that well, I mentioned that I would make a video and that I would also give an alternate assignment that folks could complete if they wanted to earn a higher grade for that week 2, part 2 assignment. So what I have done is I have in that week 2, part 2 section in Moodle, I've opened up a new assignment that is simply titled Alternate Week 2, Part 2 Unit Assignment. And for this assignment, if you complete numbers 7 and 8 under exercise 3.2 and 5 and 7 under exercise 3.3, and submit those in that new submission area by 11:59 p.m. On Thursday, July 3rd, then if your score on these is higher than your score on the original week 1 part 2 unit assignment, I will use the higher score in calculating your grade. So as always, reach out with any questions or if there's anything that I can clear up.